The year is 1400, and somewhere off the coast of the North Sea, a small wooden vessel cuts through the darkening waters. No cannons, no treasure chests, no dramatic sword fights, just a handful of men with nets, salt and knives heading out into the night to catch fish. Sounds boring, right? Well, these weren't just any fishermen, and this wasn't just any fishing trip. This was the herring fleet, and what they were doing would feed entire towns, fuel international trade, and create fortunes that would make modern tech billionaires jealous. The herring trade in medieval Europe was absolutely massive. We're talking about an industry so important that entire wars were fought over fishing rights. Cities rose and fell based on their access to these silver fish. The Dutch built their entire maritime empire on herring, and the profits were so enormous that they called herrings swimming gold. One good season could set a crew up for life, while a bad one might leave families starving through winter. But here's the thing that blows my mind about these medieval fishermen. They were pulling off something that would challenge modern fishing fleets, working with nothing but wind power, wooden boats, and hand-woven nets. They'd venture miles out to sea in all weather, catch thousands of pounds of fish, preserve them perfectly without refrigeration, and bring them back to market in perfect condition. They were basically running a floating food processing operation using technology from the year 1400. If you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval maritime life, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And drop a comment letting me know what you find most interesting about these old-school fishing operations. Did you know that some herring boats could stay at sea for weeks at a time, or that the salting techniques they used are still considered superior to many modern preservation methods? Let me know what surprises you most about life on these medieval fishing boats. Now let me paint you a picture of what it was really like aboard one of these herring buses. First off, these weren't your typical fishing boats. A herring bus was specifically designed for one purpose: catching and processing herring in massive quantities. These vessels were usually around 60 feet long, which might not sound huge, but when you consider they had to carry a crew of 12 to 20 men, plus all their nets, barrels, salt, and equipment, space was tighter than a medieval monastery cell. The crew hierarchy was surprisingly complex for such a small vessel. At the top was the skipper, who wasn't just the captain but also the businessman, navigator, and weather predictor all rolled into one. He had to know where to find the herring schools, how to read the wind and weather, and most importantly, how to turn those fish into profit. Below him was the mate, who handled most of the actual fishing operations and kept the crew working efficiently. Then came the experienced fishermen, the regular hands, and at the bottom, the boys who were learning the trade. These weren't casual fishing trips either. A typical herring season lasted from June to December, and during that time, crews would spend weeks at sea. They'd leave port with enough supplies to last for extended voyages, including barrels of beer, because fresh water was too precious to waste on drinking, salt for preserving the catch, and enough food to keep the crew fed while they worked around the clock during the peak fishing periods. The preparation for each trip was like organizing a military expedition. Every barrel had to be inspected for leaks, every net checked for holes, and every piece of equipment secured. The salt alone was a major investment. A single herring bus would carry several tons of salt, and not just any salt would do. The quality of the salt determined how well the herring would preserve, and poor preservation meant the entire catch would be worthless by the time they reached port. Speaking of nets, these weren't simple fishing nets. Herring drift nets were massive affairs, sometimes stretching over a mile when fully deployed. They were made from hemp rope, hand-twisted and hand-woven by skilled net makers who were artists in their own right. A single net could take months to make, and a complete set for a herring bus represented an investment equivalent to buying several modern cars. These nets had to be strong enough to hold tons of fish, yet light enough for the crew to handle, and flexible enough to move with the currents without tearing. The actual fishing technique was called drift netting, and it was both an art and a science. The crew would deploy their nets in a long line, with cork floats keeping the top edge at the surface and lead weights keeping the bottom at the right depth. The nets formed a wall in the water, and as the herring swam into them, they'd get tangled by their gills. The trick was knowing where to set the nets, at what depth, and how to read the signs that told you when the herring were running. Timing was everything in the herring trade. Herring are migratory fish, and they move in massive schools following predictable patterns. But these patterns change with the seasons, the weather, and even the phases of the moon. A skilled skipper could predict where the herring would be weeks in advance, but even the best sometimes guessed wrong. The difference between setting nets in the right spot and the wrong spot could mean the difference between a fortune and bankruptcy. The working conditions aboard these boats were brutal by modern standards. The crew worked in shifts around the clock, with some men always on watch, while others hauled nets or processed fish. When the herring were running thick, nobody slept for more than a few hours at a time. The work was cold, wet, and dangerous. Men regularly fell overboard, got crushed by heavy nets, or simply collapsed from exhaustion, but the money kept them coming back. A successful herring fisherman could earn more in a single season than a craftsman made in several years. The best skippers became wealthy men who owned multiple boats and employed dozens of workers. Some fishing families built dynasties that lasted for generations, passing down not just boats and equipment, but also the secret knowledge of where to find fish and how to process them properly. The herring themselves were incredibly valuable because they were perfect for long-term storage. Unlike many fish that spoil quickly, properly salted herring could last for months or even years without refrigeration. This made them ideal for feeding armies, supplying ships on long voyages, and feeding populations during the lean winter months when fresh food was scarce. Different grades of herring commanded different prices. The finest herring were caught at specific times of year when the fish were fattest and most flavorful. These premium fish were carefully sorted, perfectly processed, and packed in the best barrels with the highest quality salt. They'd be sold to wealthy customers who could afford to pay premium prices for the best fish. The processing work itself required incredible skill. Each fish had to be gutted in a specific way that preserved the meat while removing the parts that would cause spoilage. The technique was called gibbing, and a skilled gibber could process hundreds of fish per hour with just a few precise knife cuts. The fish were then washed in seawater, sorted by size and quality, and packed in barrels with exactly the right amount of salt. Even the bar-exact specifications, with specific types of wood that wooden rules were specialized. Herring barrels were made to impart unwanted flavors to the fish. The staves had to be perfectly fitted to prevent leaks, and the hoops had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure of tightly packed fish and salt. A single leaky barrel could ruin an entire shipment, so barrel makers were valued craftsmen whose work was inspected carefully before each voyage. The weather was always a major factor in herring fishing. These boats had to operate in the North Sea during autumn and winter, when storms were frequent and conditions were harsh. A sudden squall could destroy nets worth a fortune, and heavy seas could make it impossible to work. Smart skippers learned to read the weather signs and knew when to seek shelter and when to press on despite dangerous conditions. Navigation was another challenge. These boats operated far from shore, often in fog or darkness, using only the most basic instruments. Skippers navigated by stars, by the color of the water, by the behavior of seabirds, and by knowledge passed down through generations of fishermen. Getting lost at sea wasn't just an inconvenience, it could mean death for the entire crew. The social structure of the herring fleet was fascinating. Each boat was like a small floating community, with its own customs and traditions. Experienced crew members taught newcomers not just how to fish, but how to survive at sea. There were unwritten rules about everything, from how to share food to how to settle disputes. Breaking these rules could get you kicked off the boat, and in the close-knit fishing communities, a bad reputation could end your career. The economic impact of the herring trade reached far beyond the fishing boats themselves. Entire industries grew up around herring fishing. There were net makers, barrel makers, salt merchants, boat builders, and dozens of other crafts that depended on the herring fleet. Coastal towns competed fiercely to attract fishing fleets to their harbours, offering better facilities, lower taxes, and more favourable trading terms. The seasonal rhythm of the herring trade shaped entire communities. When the fleet was out, towns would empty of their working-age men, leaving behind wives, children, and old folks to manage everything else. But when the boats returned with their holds full of silver fish, these same towns exploded into frantic activity. Everyone had a job to do from the moment the first sail appeared on the horizon until the last barrel was loaded onto a merchant cart. The arrival of a successful herring fleet was like Christmas morning, and payday rolled into one chaotic celebration. Word would spread through town faster than gossip at a church social. Kids would run through the streets shouting that the boats were coming in, and within minutes, the entire waterfront would be swarming with people. Merchants hurried to the docks with their scales and cash boxes. Coopers rushed to inspect barrels, and labourers gathered to unload the precious cargo. But here's what made the whole system really work: the incredible speed at which everything had to happen once the boats reached port. Fresh herring had a very short shelf life, even when properly iced. The clock was ticking from the moment those fish came out of the water, and every hour of delay meant money lost. The crews had already done most of the preservation work at sea, but the final processing and packing had to be completed quickly and perfectly. The tallyman was one of the most important people in this whole operation. This guy had to count every single fish, grade them for quality, and keep track of which crew caught what. It sounds simple, but when you're dealing with thousands of fish from multiple boats, all while merchants are breathing down your neck and crews are demanding their pay, it required the mathematical skills of an accountant and the nerves of a bomb disposal expert. Quality control was absolutely ruthless. Merchants knew that their reputation depended on selling consistently good fish, so they'd reject entire barrels if they found even a few substandard herring mixed in. The grading system was incredibly detailed. Fish were sorted by size, fat content, freshness, and even the time of year they were caught. A barrel marked as premium grade commanded prices that were sometimes double what second-grade fish brought. The economic ripple effects were enormous. A good herring season could transform a struggling coastal town into a prosperous trading centre overnight. Suddenly, everyone had money to spend. Taverns overflowed with celebrating fishermen, shops sold out of goods, and craftsmen worked around the clock to meet demand. But a failed season could bankrupt entire communities, leaving families struggling to survive the winter. The salt trade was intricately connected to herring fishing. The best salt came from specific regions where the climate and methods produced crystals with exactly the right properties for preserving fish. Some salt was too coarse and wouldn't penetrate the fish properly. Other salt was too fine and would dissolve too quickly. The premium salt commanded premium prices, but using cheap salt could ruin an entire catch. Smart fishing operations often had exclusive contracts with salt producers, guaranteeing quality and supply. Storage and transportation presented their own challenges. Once the herring were properly packed and sealed, they had to be kept in the right conditions until they reached their final destination. Too much heat would cause spoilage, too much moisture would dilute the salt, and rough handling could damage the delicate fish. Merchants developed elaborate systems of warehouses, transport routes, and handling procedures to ensure their product reached customers in perfect condition. The international trade in preserved herring was surprisingly sophisticated for medieval times. Dutch herring were shipped as far as Russia and the Mediterranean. English herring competed in French markets. German merchants established trading posts in Scandinavia specifically to handle fish exports. Exchange rates, trade agreements, and shipping schedules all revolved around the herring seasons. Credit systems developed around the herring trade that were remarkably modern in their complexity. Merchants would advance money to fishing crews before the season started, essentially betting on future catches. Successful crews could negotiate better terms each year, while crews with poor track records found it harder and harder to get financing. Some families mortgaged their houses and boats for multiple seasons in advance, creating a web of debt and obligation that tied entire communities to the success or failure of the herring runs. The boats themselves were marvels of specialized engineering. Every aspect of their design was optimized for herring fishing. The shape of the hull affected how the boat drifted with the nets deployed. The placement of the masts determined how easily the crew could work the rigging while hauling nets. Even the interior layout was carefully planned to maximize the efficiency of fish processing and storage. Different regions developed their own variations of herring boat design, each claiming advantages for their local fishing conditions. Scottish boats were built to handle the rough waters around the Hebrides. Dutch buses were optimized for the shallow waters of the Zuider Zee. English boats were designed for quick trips to nearby fishing grounds. These regional differences weren't just matters of tradition, they reflected real understanding of how boat design affected fishing success. The competition between different fishing fleets was intense and sometimes violent. Disputes over fishing grounds led to confrontations that were essentially naval battles between civilian boats. Some regions established formal patrol systems to protect their fishing fleets from foreign competitors. Treaties between nations often included detailed provisions about fishing rights and access to traditional herring grounds. Weather prediction became a crucial skill for herring fishermen. They developed an elaborate folklore of signs and omens that helped them predict storms, wind changes, and the movement of fish schools. The color of the sunset, the behavior of seabirds, the direction of ocean swells. All these factors were carefully observed and interpreted. Some skippers became famous for their ability to predict weather days in advance, and their services were sought by other boat captains. The crew dynamics aboard herring boats were complex social systems that had to function perfectly under extreme stress. A single troublemaker could ruin an entire voyage, while a crew that worked well together could achieve remarkable things. Experienced skippers developed sophisticated methods for selecting crew members, combining fishing skills with personality traits that would contribute to group harmony during long voyages. Training new fishermen was an elaborate apprenticeship system that could take years to complete. Young men started as boat boys, doing the simplest and most dangerous jobs while learning the basics of seamanship. Gradually, they'd be taught more complex skills like net mending, fish processing, and eventually navigation and weather reading. Only after proving themselves over multiple seasons would they be trusted with positions of real responsibility. The tools of the trade were surprisingly sophisticated. Fishing knives were forged to specific shapes and tempers that made them perfect for gutting herring quickly and cleanly. Net needles were carved from bone or wood with precise dimensions that affected how easily nets could be mended. Even the barrels were cooperated to exacting standards, with specific wood types and construction techniques that maximize preservation while minimizing weight and cost. The financial records from medieval herring operations reveal numbers that would make your head spin. A single successful herring bus could generate profits equivalent to what a skilled craftsman earned in 5 years. But here's the catch, and trust me, that pun is absolutely intended. The investment required to get into the herring business was enormous. You needed the boat, the nets, the barrels, the salt, the crew wages, and enough working capital to survive the inevitable bad seasons. Smart investors rarely put all their money into one boat. Instead, they'd buy shares in multiple vessels, spreading their risk across different crews and fishing grounds. This created a complex web of ownership where a single boat might have 10 or 15 different investors, each owning a percentage of the profits. The paperwork alone would give modern accountants nightmares, especially considering they were doing it all with quill pens and parchment. The most successful herring merchants weren't necessarily the best fishermen. They were the ones who understood the business side of the operation. They knew which markets paid the highest prices, which trade routes were most profitable, and how to time their sales for maximum return. Some merchants never set foot on a fishing boat, but made fortunes simply by buying fish at the docks and selling them in distant markets. Currency exchange added another layer of complexity to the herring trade. A Dutch merchant selling fish in London had to deal with different currencies, varying exchange rates, and the risk that rates might change while his cargo was in transit. Some clever traders figured out how to use these currency fluctuations to their advantage, essentially trading money while they traded fish. Insurance was practically unheard of in 1400, which meant that every voyage was a huge gamble. Lose a boat to storms, and you lost everything invested in it. Have a net tear at the wrong moment, and an entire season's work could be ruined. The psychological pressure on fishing crews was immense. They weren't just trying to catch fish, they were trying to avoid financial catastrophe for themselves and their investors. The herring processing techniques developed by these medieval fishermen were so effective that many are still used today. The gibbing method, that specific way of gutting herring that preserved the meat while removing the parts that would spoil, was perfected through centuries of trial and error. A master gibber could process a fish in less than 10 seconds with just 2 cuts of his knife, and the result would keep perfectly for months. Barrel packing was another art form that took years to master. The fish had to be layered in precise patterns with exact amounts of salt between each layer. Too little salt, and the fish would spoil. Too much salt, and you'd waste expensive preservation material while making the fish too salty to eat. The best packers could fill a barrel so efficiently that every cubic inch was used, maximizing the value of each shipment. Different types of herring required different processing methods. Fish caught early in the season were leaner and needed different salt ratios than the fat herring caught later in the year. Pregnant female herring were processed differently than males. Even the size of the fish affected how they were gutted and packed. A crew that understood these subtleties could command premium prices for their catch. The waste products from herring processing weren't actually waste at all. Fish heads and guts were sold to farmers as fertilizer. Fish oil extracted during processing was used for lamps and waterproofing. Even the scales were collected and sold to craftsmen who used them in decorative work. Nothing was thrown away because everything had value in a world where resources were precious. Quality control extended far beyond just sorting good fish from bad. Merchants developed elaborate grading systems that took into account dozens of factors. The clarity of the fish's eyes, the firmness of the flesh, the color of the skin, even the smell, all were evaluated by experts who could assess the quality of a barrel's contents just by examining a few sample fish. The timing of herring runs was influenced by factors that medieval fishermen didn't fully understand but learned to predict through generations of observation. Water temperature, currents, the abundance of the tiny creatures that herring feed on, even the phases of the moon all affected when and where the fish would appear. Some skippers kept detailed logs of conditions and catches, creating databases of information that gave them competitive advantages. Competition between fishing fleets sometimes led to industrial espionage that would make modern corporate spies proud. Crews would try to follow successful boats to discover their secret fishing grounds. Merchants would attempt to steal trade secrets about processing techniques or salt suppliers. Some fishing communities developed elaborate codes and signals to communicate information without revealing it to competitors. The social hierarchy within fishing communities was based not just on wealth but on knowledge and skill. A skipper who consistently found fish when others came back empty-handed earned respect that money couldn't buy. Young fishermen would compete for positions on successful boats, knowing that learning from master fishermen was more valuable than higher wages on less skilled crews. Marriage alliances often followed fishing boat partnerships. Families would arrange marriages between their children to cement business relationships between different fishing operations. A daughter married to a successful boat owner could secure her family's access to profitable fishing ventures for generations. These weren't just personal relationships, they were strategic business decisions. The religious aspects of herring fishing were deeply intertwined with the practical ones. Fishing crews followed elaborate rituals designed to ensure good catches and safe voyages. Boats were blessed by priests before each season. Crews would pray together before deploying nets. Some fishing communities had patron saints specifically associated with herring fishing, and the feast days were timed to coincide with the fishing seasons. Superstitions developed around every aspect of the herring trade. Certain days were considered unlucky for starting voyages. Some crews wouldn't allow women aboard their boats, believing it would curse their catch. Others had elaborate rituals for the first, but in a world where success or failure often depended on factors beyond human control, psychological fish caught each season. These beliefs might seem silly, now comfort was valuable. The medical knowledge of fishing crews was surprisingly advanced for its time. They had to deal with injuries and illnesses far from any doctor, so they developed their own remedies and treatments. Cuts from fish knives were common, so crews became expert at cleaning and bandaging wounds. Seasickness, hypothermia, and exhaustion were constant threats that required practical solutions. Nutrition on herring boats was better than you might expect. The crews had access to fresh fish daily, which provided high-quality protein. They also carried supplies of bread, beer, and preserved foods that gave them a reasonably balanced diet. Some crews even brought livestock aboard for longer voyages, though keeping animals alive on a small boat presented its own challenges. The economic cycles of herring fishing created boom and bust periods that affected entire regions. A series of good seasons could transform poor coastal villages into prosperous trading centers. But when herring runs failed or shifted to different areas, communities that had grown dependent on fishing income could collapse virtually overnight. Some towns that were major fishing centers in 1400 had disappeared completely by 1500. International politics regularly disrupted the herring trade. Wars between nations could close off traditional fishing grounds or trading routes. Embargo and trade disputes affected prices and access to markets. Some fishing fleets found themselves caught in the middle of naval conflicts, with their boats commandeered for military use or their crews pressed into naval service. The environmental impact of medieval herring fishing was minimal compared to modern industrial fishing, but it wasn't zero. Heavy fishing pressure could affect local fish populations, and crews had to adapt when traditional fishing grounds became less productive. Some regions implemented early conservation measures, limiting the number of boats allowed to fish certain areas, or restricting fishing during spawning seasons. Communication between boats at sea relied on a complex system of signals using flags, lanterns, and even smoke during daylight hours. Crews developed codes that allowed them to share information about fish locations, weather conditions, and potential dangers without alerting competitors to their most valuable secrets. A skilled signalman was as valuable as a good navigator. The technological innovations that emerged from herring fishing influenced shipbuilding and maritime technology for centuries. Improvements in net design led to advances in rope making and textile production. Better preservation methods influenced food storage techniques across many industries. Even improvements in barrel making had applications far beyond the fishing trade. Record keeping in the herring trade was surprisingly sophisticated for medieval times. Successful merchants maintained detailed logs of catches, prices, weather conditions, and market trends. This information was valuable enough that some merchants kept their records in code to prevent competitors from stealing their business intelligence. The most successful fishing families built their prosperity on generations of accumulated knowledge about fish behavior and market conditions. The preservation techniques themselves tell a fascinating story about medieval innovation. While modern food processing relies on refrigeration and chemical preservatives, these 15th century fishermen achieved results that would impress any modern food scientist. The secret lay in understanding the precise relationship between salt, moisture, and time. Too much salt would draw out so much moisture that the fish became inedibly dry. Too little salt would allow bacteria to take hold and spoil the entire barrel. The sweet spot required knowledge that took generations to perfect. Master processors could judge the exact salt requirements just by feeling the fish. They'd press the flesh with their thumbs, checking for firmness and fat content. A lean herring caught early in the season needed different treatment than a fat fish caught during peak season. The salt itself came from different sources, each with unique properties. Bay salt from France had larger crystals that penetrated slowly but provided even preservation. Rock salt from England dissolved quickly, but could create pockets of over-salted fish if not distributed perfectly. The packing process was like assembling a three-dimensional puzzle where every piece had to fit exactly right. Fish were arranged in specific patterns that maximized space while ensuring proper salt distribution. Bellies faced up, heads pointed in alternating directions, and each layer was positioned to prevent air pockets that could harbor spoilage. A perfectly packed barrel contained exactly 500 fish, weighed precisely 120 pounds when full, and would keep for up to 2 years if stored properly. Temperature control during processing was critical, though these fishermen had no thermometers to guide them. They learned to read subtle signs that told them when conditions were right for salting. The feel of the air on their skin, the behavior of the fish during processing, even the way salt crystals looked in different weather conditions, all provided clues about how well the preservation would work. Different markets demanded different processing styles, which added complexity to the operation. German customers preferred their herring packed in smaller barrels with lighter salt. French buyers wanted larger fish with heavier preservation. English markets paid premium prices for herring processed within hours of being caught, while distant markets needed fish that could survive long transportation delays. The business negotiations that took place on medieval docks were as complex as any modern commodity trading. Prices fluctuated based on the quality of the catch, the size of the harvest, news from other fishing ports, and even rumors about political situations that might affect trade routes. Smart merchants kept networks of informants who could provide intelligence about market conditions in distant cities days or weeks before official news arrived. Credit arrangements were surprisingly sophisticated. A successful fishing crew might sell their catch on terms that wouldn't be fully paid until the fish reached their final destination months later. This meant merchants were essentially betting on the quality of the preservation as well as market conditions that might change dramatically during transportation. Some deals included clauses that adjusted prices based on the condition of the fish when they were finally opened for sale. The most valuable herring weren't necessarily the largest or most numerous. Premium fish were those caught at exactly the right moment in the herring's life cycle, when fat content was highest and flavor was at its peak. These fish commanded prices that were sometimes 10 times higher than ordinary herring. A single barrel of premium fish could earn more than a craftsman's annual wages, but achieving that quality required perfect timing, ideal weather conditions, and flawless processing. Storage facilities on shore were marvels of medieval engineering designed specifically for herring preservation. These warehouses had to maintain constant temperature and humidity while protecting valuable cargo from theft and spoilage. Some storage buildings used underground chambers that stayed naturally cool. Others employed elaborate ventilation systems that circulated air without allowing moisture to build up. The coopering trade that supported herring fishing was an art form in itself. Herring barrels weren't just containers, they were precision instruments designed to maintain exact internal conditions for months or years. The wood had to be seasoned for specific lengths of time to eliminate flavors that might taint the fish. The hoops had to be tensioned exactly right to prevent leaks without crushing the delicate cargo inside. Quality standards were enforced through guild systems that were more rigorous than modern food safety regulations. Master coopers had to demonstrate their skills by creating test barrels that were filled with brine and monitored for leaks over extended periods. A cooper whose barrels failed could lose his license to work in the herring trade, effectively ending his career. The transportation networks that moved processed herring across Europe were logistical achievements that rival modern supply chains. Fish caught off the Scottish coast might end up on dinner tables in Bavaria within 6 weeks. passing through the hands of a dozen different merchants and surviving journeys by boat, cart, and pack animal across hundreds of miles of medieval roads. Weather delays during transportation could ruin entire shipments, so merchants developed elaborate contingency plans. Alternative routes were scouted and mapped. Backup storage facilities were established at key points along major trade routes. Some merchants even maintained their own transportation fleets to ensure reliable delivery schedules. The financial instruments that developed around herring trading were remarkably modern in their complexity. Letters of credit allowed merchants to conduct business across international borders without carrying dangerous amounts of cash. Insurance-like arrangements spread risk among multiple investors. Some merchants even engaged in what we'd now call futures trading, agreeing to buy fish that hadn't been caught yet at prices negotiated months in advance. Currency fluctuations added another layer of complexity to international herring trading. A merchant who sold fish for English pounds but needed to pay his crew in Dutch guilders had to factor exchange rate risks into his pricing. Some clever traders learned to use currency arbitrage to increase their profits, essentially making money by moving money between different monetary systems. The seasonal rhythms of herring fishing created economic cycles that affected entire regions. Coastal towns would swell with temporary workers during fishing season, then empty out during the off-season. Merchants had to manage cash flow carefully, earning most of their income during a few intense months while maintaining operations year-round. Banking services developed specifically to serve the herring trade. Specialized lenders understood the unique risks and opportunities of fishing ventures. They'd advance money against future catches, finance boat construction, and even provide foreign exchange services for international traders. Some medieval banking houses built their entire business around the herring industry. The competition between different fishing regions was fierce and sometimes led to actual conflicts. Dutch fishermen claimed exclusive rights to certain fishing grounds based on centuries of tradition. English crews disputed those claims, leading to confrontations that were essentially naval battles between civilian boats. Some regions established formal patrol systems to protect their fishing fleets from foreign competitors. Technological espionage was common in the herring trade. Crews would attempt to steal processing secrets from competitors. Merchants tried to discover the sources of superior salt or the details of preservation techniques that gave rivals advantages in the marketplace. Some fishing communities developed elaborate security measures to protect their trade secrets. The most successful herring operations were family enterprises that passed knowledge down through generations. A father would teach his sons not just how to fish, but where to find the best grounds, how to read weather patterns, and which merchants could be trusted. This accumulated knowledge gave established families significant advantages over newcomers to the trade. Marriage alliances in fishing communities often followed business considerations as much as personal preferences. A daughter married to a successful boat owner could secure her family's access to profitable fishing ventures. These weren't just personal relationships. They were strategic business decisions that could affect multiple generations. The religious aspects of herring fishing were deeply practical as well as spiritual. Fishing crews followed elaborate rituals designed to ensure good catches and safe voyages. But these rituals also served to build crew cohesion and establish leadership hierarchies. A captain who could maintain crew morale through religious observance had significant advantages during difficult voyages. Superstitions developed around every aspect of herring fishing, but many had practical foundations. Certain weather patterns really were associated with poor catches or dangerous conditions. Some crew behaviors really did affect fishing success. Over time, these practical observations became ritualized into beliefs that guided crew behavior, even when the original reasoning was forgotten. The medical knowledge of fishing crews was surprisingly advanced for medieval times. They had to deal with injuries and illnesses far from any doctor, so they developed their own remedies and treatments. Cuts from processing knives were common, so crews became expert at wound care. Seasickness, hypothermia, and exhaustion required practical solutions that couldn't wait for professional medical help. Nutrition on herring boats was actually better than what many land-based workers enjoyed. The crews had access to fresh fish daily, providing high-quality protein. They also carried supplies of bread, beer, and preserved foods that created reasonably balanced diets. Some crews even brought small livestock aboard for longer voyages, though keeping animals alive on a small boat presented obvious challenges. The waste products from herring processing weren't actually waste at all in a medieval economy where nothing was discarded if it had any possible value. Fish heads and guts were sold to farmers as fertilizer, creating side income streams for fishing operations. Fish oil extracted during processing was used for lamps, waterproofing, and even soap making. Even scales were collected and sold to craftsmen who used them in decorative work. Environmental awareness among medieval fishermen was limited but not non-existent. Experienced crews understood that overfishing certain areas could reduce future catches. Some regions implemented early conservation measures, limiting the number of boats allowed in specific areas or restricting fishing during spawning seasons. These weren't motivated by modern environmental consciousness, but by practical concerns about maintaining profitable fishing grounds. The international politics of herring fishing were complex and constantly changing. Wars between nations could close traditional fishing grounds or trading routes overnight. Diplomatic relations affected market access and pricing. Some fishing fleets found themselves caught in the middle of larger conflicts, with their boats commandeered for military use or their crews pressed into naval service. Trade agreements between nations often included specific provisions about fishing rights and herring commerce. These weren't minor diplomatic details, but major economic issues that could affect the prosperity of entire regions. Some wars were fought partly over access to fishing grounds or disputes about herring trading rights. The social mobility possible through herring fishing was remarkable for medieval society. A skilled fisherman from a poor family could potentially become wealthy enough to buy his own boat and hire crews. Some fishing fortunes grew large enough that their owners became significant political figures in their communities. The herring trade created opportunities for advancement that were rare in other medieval occupations. Women played important roles in herring fishing communities, though these contributions are often overlooked in historical records. They managed household finances while men were at sea, processed fish on shore, maintained equipment, and sometimes even invested in fishing ventures. Some widows of successful fishermen continued operating boats and processing facilities after their husbands died. The educational systems in fishing communities were practical and focused on skills needed for the trade. Young men learned mathematics through calculating catches and profits. They studied geography through learning trade routes and fishing grounds. Navigation required understanding of astronomy and weather patterns. The herring trade created its own informal but sophisticated educational curriculum. Record-keeping in fishing communities was more advanced than in many other medieval occupations. Successful merchants maintained detailed logs of catches, prices, weather conditions, and market trends. This information was valuable enough that some merchants kept their records in code to prevent competitors from accessing their business intelligence. Communication systems developed by herring fishermen influenced maritime practices for centuries. Signal codes using flags and lanterns allowed boats to coordinate activities and share information. These systems were sophisticated enough to convey complex messages about fish locations, weather conditions, and market intelligence while keeping sensitive information from competitors. The technological innovations that emerged from herring fishing had applications far beyond the fishing industry. Improvements in net design influenced textile production techniques. Better preservation methods affected food storage across many trades. Advances in barrel making had applications in brewing, wine making, and general cargo transportation. The repair and maintenance of herring boats during the medieval period required skills that would impress modern shipwrights. These weren't pleasure craft that could limp back to harbour at the first sign of trouble. When you're 20 miles offshore in a North Sea gale, with a hold full of valuable fish, Fixing problems on the spot wasn't optional. It was survival. The most common emergency repairs involved the nets themselves. A single tear in a drift net could cost a crew their entire catch for that night. Imagine trying to sew together a fishing net the size of a football field while your boat pitches and rolls in heavy seas. The mending had to be perfect because herring are clever fish. They'll find even the smallest gap and swim right through it, taking half the school with them. Net repair was an art that took years to master. The fishermen used special needles carved from bone or hardwood, sized specifically for the hemp twine used in net construction. The stitching technique wasn't just about closing holes. It had to maintain the exact mesh size that would catch herring by their gills without allowing them to escape or become so tangled they'd damage the fish. A poorly mended net might catch fish, but if those fish were mangled in the process, they'd be worthless in the premium markets. The tools for net mending were as precious as any other equipment on board. A good bone needle could last for years if properly cared for, but lose it overboard, and you might have to fashion a replacement from a fishbone or piece of scrapwood. Some crews carried spare needles made from different materials: bone for fine work, wood for heavy repairs, and occasionally even metal needles traded from skilled craftsmen on shore. Weather damage to rigging was another constant concern. The masts on herring boats weren't just for sailing. They supported the complex system of pulleys and lines needed to deploy and retrieve the massive drift nets. When a storm snapped a stay or damaged a block, the crew had to improvise repairs using whatever materials they had on hand. A broken pulley might be replaced with a carefully carved piece of wood. A snapped line could be spliced back together, though the repair would always be a weak point that needed constant monitoring. The most challenging repairs involved damage to the boat's hull. Unlike larger vessels that might carry spare planks, herring boats had to make do with whatever was available. A hole punched by floating debris might be temporarily patched with canvas and tar, but more serious damage required creative solutions. Some crews learned to split barrel staves to create makeshift planks, though this meant sacrificing valuable storage containers. Hull repairs often had to be done while the boat was still at sea, sometimes in conditions that would terrify modern sailors. The crew would rig temporary patches from the inside while one or two brave souls went over the side with ropes and tools to work on the exterior. This was incredibly dangerous work. Falling overboard in heavy seas while wearing the thick woolen clothes of a medieval fisherman was essentially a death sentence. The caulking that sealed gaps between hull planks required constant attention. The expansion and contraction of wood in the marine environment meant that even the best-built boats developed leaks over time. Crews carried supplies of oakum, old rope fibres picked apart and soaked in tar, to stuff into gaps, but applying it properly required skill and experience. Too little caulking and water would pour in. Too much and you might actually weaken the hull structure. So next time you bite into a piece of fish or complain about your job being too demanding, remember those medieval herring crews who turned impossible conditions into incredible fortunes. They proved that with enough skill, determination, and really good salt, you could build an empire one fish at a time. Those simple nets and barrels of salt didn't just feed Europe. They created the foundation for everything that followed.